Welcome. I'm Charmin Prince. I'm the host of ENYTING Gender Podcast. This is our very first episode. And ENYTING Gender Podcast is a podcast that is geared to address gender, gender stereotypes, gender biases, gender inequalities, gender rights, and so I'm creating a space so we can have this discussion. And this podcast is, scheduled to be monthly, but I'm sure it will be bi-weekly in a short period, maybe in a month or two. But right now it's monthly. And I am honored to have my very first guest and welcome Pierre Brouard. And Pierre is the acting director of the Center for Sexualities, AIDS, and Gender at the University of Pretoria. He's also a clinical psychologist with a legacy in HIV work since the 1980s. Pierre unites his passion for sexualities, gender, and social justice to challenge stigma and drive transformation. Join us for a profound discussion on gender rights, diversity, and creating equitable spaces. As someone with their finger on the pulse of social change, Pierre challenges us to think more deeply about the roles we play within our communities and the influences we can have in shaping a more equitable future. Prepare to be enlightened and inspired as we delve into the subjects at the heart of transformation with a psychologist who has seen the landscape of gender rights evolve over decades and is still at the forefront of advocating for progress. Welcome, welcome, Pierre, and thank you for being our very first guest. And I am honored. Did I leave out anything in that bio that you wanted to add?
Not at all. And thank you for having me as your first guest. I'm the one who's honored to be here because, it's not lost on me, Shaman, that I'm a man and that I'm your first guest to be talking about gender. And in some quarters that might be seen as provocative or challenging or even problematic because I guess, as my sort of opening statement, if you like, who you are matters in transformation work. You people see who you are and what you represent simply by your bodily self as it presents in the world. So in my case, my maleness, my whiteness, my age, all of those are important factors that I suppose not only have shaped my experiences of the world, but people see that as well. I often say when you enter a room, particularly in the South African context, but perhaps in others too, the first two things that are evident are your gender and your color or your race or your ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
And people, because it is in the nature of being human, that we will immediately respond to that physical presence with something that sometimes is unconscious, preconscious, or subconscious, some kind of feeling. As kids, young people say today, I felt some kind of way about, then they will see, so Shaman has a man speaking on gender, or in the South African context, a white man speaking on gender. I think that's interesting. I mean, I have things to offer, I have things to say, but I acknowledge that this means that people will see me in a particular way. And in some instances, I would also wish to think about, for example, in a workplace or organizational setting, whose voices dominate. I'm already going into the gender topic here, whose voices dominate, whose voices are heard first in meetings or in decision making or in spaces of power and representation. So, I mean, I think that's interesting to think about. I think about it a lot in terms of who do we listen to, whose voices often are heard first. Do I have a duty sometimes to step back and say, well, what do other people think? Acknowledge that men's voices often, are naturally the ones that come to the fore first. So already, I think I'm giving you a sense of where I'm coming from and how I position myself in gender work.
Well, thank you for that, Pierre. And I chose you as my first guest for the following reasons. Your knowledge about gender has expanded my desire and you were an inspiration for me to delve deeper into the gender space and find my place there. So I wouldn't have it anywhere, any other way, other than having you as my first guest. Secondly, I did not even think about the gender roles that we often hear the male's voice first. But what for me, it was about information. It was about the impact that you had on me. The very first time I heard you in that change make, I was like, "Ooh, I whatever he's teaching, I need to be there." And so I am honored to have you. I'm honored for you to share all your knowledge, within the time space and the time frame that we have. And I know this will not be your first appearance on and your only appearance on this podcast. So thank you again, and thank you for starting the discussion the way that you did. But my first question for you, Pierre, what locates you geographically and historically?
Thanks, and thanks for your kind words, Shaman, about your experience of my early interventions when we first met. I do love that work. It is an incredible privilege to be able to talk about gender to many participants across the African continent, because it is such a diverse continent and people bring many different stories and histories and traditions and cultures, but all of it comes into the workplace where all these mixes and mixtures happen, and finding a common way of being in the workplace is an interesting challenge with all those influences coming together. And it's I've learned an incredible amount from that work as well, to find ways to think about gender that connects to people's lives and stories and doesn't feel as if I'm coming as an outside expert to lecture to people. As you would recall, I think my approach is, and our approach as a center is participatory learning, drawing deeply on the experiences and lives of participants. And that's really what is life-giving for me in the work. What locates me? Obviously, I'm South African. I'm not sure if that was obvious. Our university is in South Africa. I'm born in South Africa, which is an African country, but clearly I have white European ancestry. On my mother's side, Dutch and German background. My father's side, I'm French Mauritian. So he was born in Mauritius, the island of Mauritius, but his parents and history goes back to mainland France. So, already politically in South Africa, we are a country with a complicated history of colonialism, apartheid, which was a form of institutionalized, legalized racism and oppression towards indigenous and Black South Africans. So to be a white South African is to be already positioned in some ways, in terms of a history of belonging to a group that is historically oppressive towards Black people, towards Indigenous South Africans. So I grew up in the height of the apartheid or separate development state. We had a white minority government and a very, very rigidly enforced oppressive system of racial separation. So I grew up with whiteness, if you like, in white suburb, in white cities. In apartheid South Africa, I was born in 1959 and schooled into the 60s and 70s. That was the deep, dark years of apartheid South Africa. So to grow up white meant to grow up with separateness, and Black South Africans were othered, discriminated against legally and socially and many other ways. So your encounters with Black people were in a kind of classic relationships of power, where many Black South Africans would be working in homes or in gardens and domestic spaces. And we had laws that meant that Black people couldn't stay in white cities overnight. They would have to leave and move into Black areas in night times. And people lived according to their racial groups. And we can unpack race if there is time today. So that I think, because I grew up in a family where I had two older sisters who were politically involved and politically aware, I think already I was given some notion that the system was wrong and unacceptable and evil, frankly. And that was sort of early seeds in me of understanding that the separateness couldn't persist and was morally unjustifiable. But I think already in me was sown this idea of we can't live in this kind of society. It's not a fair and just society. And then I think also, I began to develop an understanding of my sexual orientation, which is gay, in the 1970s, and that was also an experience of othering for me. So I think in my early years, it was an interesting intertwining of a personal sense of othering, but recognizing racial otherings that were also happening in our society. There were laws, for example, in apartheid South Africa, where there was one particular law, the Immorality Act, which outlawed sexual and romantic relations between people of different race groups, particularly to protect whiteness. But those same laws were sanctioned same-sex sexualities, particularly male sexuality. So it's interesting that already in my mind as a young person, notions of what is moral and immoral were already percolating in my head. I think from a very young age, and then I, in the early 1980s, HIV came to South Africa, and already there was a sense that this was also an injustice being done, because globally there was this tremendous stigma aimed towards gay men, but also towards sex workers, towards people who use drugs. And then that quickly slipped into a kind of racist ideas that certainly from a heterosexual point of view, HIV was an African or Black disease. So I would say all those strands came together to give me personally a sense that the world isn't fair, that systems of power operate to include and exclude people, and that for things to change, communities have to, in a sense, rise up and organize and do something about that.
Thank you so much for that, Pierre. You unpack so much that we need to schedule a time to talk about race. And there's some questions that I have for you, but we wouldn't touch that now. But my follow-up question and you shared a little about that, is how do you position yourself in the work that you do?
Mhm.
Let's share some of the ideas of privilege
Yeah,
that you have
yes,
experienced and enjoyed.
absolutely. Yeah, so I think a body of work that I draw on is intersectionality theory, which you would know about. I think feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw was one of the early thinkers in this area. And essentially, the idea is that certain identities in life have privilege or power, which is given to them not because there is a formal handing over, but it is how societies are wired to regard certain identities as somehow um, better or representative of a proper humanity. Or society accords them social power, for example, to men, because most societies are wired to be patriarchal, to, to run along lines of male dominance, male power, male centrality, with men generally holding positions of authority and power, politics, economics, in the home, and many cultural and religious and other spheres. So I think what Kimberly Crenshaw was saying is that, if you that generally people have privilege around gender, so men would have privilege of women. Privilege can come around race. Generally, white people have um, privilege over people of color simply because they are white, or people who are able-bodied, or people who are perhaps middle class, or people who are educated. All of those are positions of privilege in society. But the interesting thing, I think, that Kimberly Crenshaw brought to the conversation was that when you occupy more than one identity category, in some instances, you can have privilege and power, social power, in relation to one aspect of your identity, but in another, you may lack it. So there's a sort of intersecting collision of different identity figures or identity factors, which complexify the idea of privilege. So in my own case, for example, I have privilege around maleness, around being a man. Sometimes you might call that the patriarchal dividend, the kind of rewards and social cachet and social authority and position that comes from being a man in society. And I think the interesting thing about privilege is that you don't have to work for it. It just comes to you. Society thinks that men are natural leaders, for example, or natural bosses, or natural lots of things. And so you don't have to do anything to have it. But because I'm gay, um, then in some eyes, in some societies, some spaces, that is a sort of a second-class citizenship, if you like, or a second-class identity. So in some contexts, my maleness and my sexuality would sit in a complex relationship with each other. In the South African context, and perhaps some others, perhaps the United States, for example, my whiteness gives me certain privileges, and I I'm not comfortable with having it, but I'm comfortable with acknowledging it because I think it's important that certainly white people and men and heterosexual people see that they have this kind of social power. Um, because once you see it, you can do something about dismantling those forms of power where you can. Um, and certainly there are millions of examples of how whiteness, has brought me advantage in South Africa. I can remember, for example, um, this is going to sound narcissistic, perhaps. I remember winning a, a bursary for my final year at school to go to university based on being the top Catholic student in my province in South Africa. And, over the years, I've come to realize that bursary was only for white people. And if there was open to all Catholics who were, of all colors and races and backgrounds, I'm pretty convinced I would not have won that bursary. And of course, I was 17 at the time, so perhaps less woke to the injustice of that kind of inequality. And I used the bursary to further myself and my studies. And yes, I worked hard and eventually became a psychologist. But I acknowledge the privilege of whiteness helped to carry me and make that passage easier for me. And I think gender maleness is tremendous. Men have many privileges in society, ways that they don't have to prove themselves, that women, say, for example, in the workplace, absolutely have to do all the time. And, an example that I use often, which I think is it's quite light-hearted, but I think it says so much, is if you're flying in an aeroplane and the pilot's voice comes on, and it's a man's voice, a male pilot, we don't think about his maleness. We think about his pilotness, if you like. Oh, this is a pilot. He's doing what pilots do. He's telling us about the weather and how long it'll take off and what is our flight path. But if that pilot's voice comes on and it's a woman, the first thing many people think about is her womanness before her pilotness. Because it's unusual for a woman to be a pilot, because the way privilege works is that it naturalizes powerful positions to men. And so we start thinking about, oh, this is a woman pilot. I wonder where she studied to be a pilot. And is there a man in the cockpit with her? And is she having a good day? And is there another woman in the cockpit with her? And am I comfortable being flown by a woman? This is different for me. I mean, maybe not all of what people think is bad, but the fact that we notice her gender is, for me, a fascinating thing to think about. So yeah, I think for me, privilege work is fascinating work. It's interesting. I don't feel defensive about it because I don't think that is productive. And you get people who say, well, I may have white privilege, but I've worked hard for what I've got. Or a man might say, well, the male privilege might exist, but I studied really hard at university or college to get where I am. I deserve to be here. It's not about that. It's about recognizing that we didn't all start in the same place in the first place. And I know in the United States, privilege and affirmative action is a hot conversation. And there have been steps to remove some of those affirmative action policies, which are created, I think, interesting debates in the United States. So I told you I could talk too much.
That's quite okay. That's quite okay. Thank you for unpacking intersectionality, because the term is used. A lot of people are using the term now, and listeners may not understand or know what it means. So thank you for unpacking that, and thank you for sharing your privilege. And because the first time I ever heard someone that is white acknowledge their privilege was Christy from the department, and I was blown away. After she was finished, I said, I have to offer you your flowers. And so thank you for doing that, because Christy was the very first white person I've heard who acknowledged that they had white privilege, and here you are again. So thank you for that. What inspired or motivated you to get into the work of gender?
Multiple things, I would say. I mentioned earlier, I have two older sisters who were politically aware. and feminist in their thinking. One of them, I think, has become less feminist with age. I'm a little bit critical of her. Hopefully, she won't be listening to this podcast. And the other one remained a steadfast feminist, and in fact, subsequently left South Africa for political reasons and settled in the UK. And I think just the example of older siblings, both women who had strong ideas about equality, women's equality to men. Feminism, the word feminism and feminist has become something problematic for some people. It's bewildering to me. It's seen as an insult for some people to identify as feminist, or it's seen as anti-men. And I have absolutely no agreement with that viewpoint. And for me, to be a feminist is, at its most simple, is, I think somebody once said, this revolutionary idea that women and men are equal. I don't necessarily mean the same, but certainly equal. And so that experience, I think, shaped me to see two strong women, leading independent lives and charting their own way in the world. But I would also say that grappling with my sexual orientation helped me to start think about gender, because certainly as a gay man, what happens, I think, the way that sort of masculinity works, the way that we sort of idealize certain kinds of masculinity in many societies, and require of men to be heterosexual to occupy an acceptable masculinity. What happens is that gay men's masculinity is found to be questionable. So I think certainly in myself, I began a journey of thinking, well, what is gender? What is the difference between gender and sex, in terms of sex that you're born into your body, and perhaps gender being the kinds of expectations that are placed on male bodies and female bodies in living out their lives. So already, I think, being on the receiving end of questioning about, well, what is my right to call myself a man, or what is an acceptable masculinity, and by same token, what is an acceptable femininity? I think already my interest was piqued in terms of thinking about what is gender, how does gender play out in people's lives, why do we hold certain roles for men and hold certain roles for women, why do we try and put people into gender boxes, and also to understand that there's a power system that operates underneath all of that regards men and gives men more power in society. And I think that probably the third strand was HIV work, and understanding how, from a heterosexual HIV point of view, how women are vulnerable to contracting HIV, not just biologically, because that is an aspect of it, but also socially, if you like, that the kind of social inequalities, the gender inequalities that persist in many societies, giving men power over women, power, for example, to dictate whether women can work, and also how much power they have in the home and in terms of sexual agency and decision making. That took me on a whole journey of exploration and understanding, to think about gender as being, and gender inequality as being, one of the key drivers of why women are more vulnerable to HIV when it comes to heterosexually acquired HIV. So I think if you look at all those sort of factors coming together, they've led me on to a road or a journey of consciousness, about awareness, if you like, thinking about what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Why does society set up in a particular way to disempower women? Why are societies wired that way? I think a lot of that really brought me to where I am today, which is I consider myself to be feminist, an advocate for equality of men and women. Um, and I suppose perhaps slightly more controversially, Shaman, and this may be a topic for another discussion, is also to move into the space of thinking about people who don't fit into the boxes of gender neatly. So people who are transgender or maybe identify as gender diverse or non-binary in some way. I'm very interested in what those stories tell us about the gender order.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Um, you have unpacked a lot there. But one of the things that I would like you to focus on, because oftentimes the regular person who haven't attended a gender program does not know the difference between gender and sex. You touch on it a little bit, but I'd like you to expound a little more on the difference between gender and sex.
Yeah, with pleasure. So for me, this is a critical sort of languaging to be thinking about. It really informs a lot of my own work. So sex is the biological. So everybody is born into a body that has chromosomes, genes, hormones, and reproductive organs, and internal and sort of external genitalia and formations. In most people, that sexed body is uncomplicatedly male or female. And those are the terms that we use. Um, in a small percentage of people, that clarity of either male or female isn't always there, and they would belong to a category of people we would call intersex. And the more technical term sometimes is called differences of sex development. And it's a spectrum phenomenon. So some people might only discover they're intersex later on in life. For example, they might discover, in the case of someone who's a woman, that there are undescended testes inside her, or some rarer cases born without a womb or ovaries. And there are a whole lot of variations that are, hormonal and genetic and chromosomal. Other differences are quite evident at birth. Some babies may be born with mixed genitalia. I think what is interesting about intersex people is that they sometimes, based on the external appearance, surgeons and parents make a decision to fashion the body into either a male or female. And if you could think about it, that's a kind of crossroads moment for those surgeons and parents to decide, on the basis of all the evidence we have, is this a boy or is this a girl? In some instances, the decision that they take is the wrong one. And when that person grows up and into their puberty and has an awakening around perhaps their gender identity and or sexual orientation, it doesn't fit neatly into the category of male or female that they were assigned when they were born. So I'm complexifying the term sex because I think sometimes we oversimplify it. And I'm anxious that this will make this conversation too complicated. But I do think it's interesting because nature isn't always neat. And we often take nature as our sort of guide about, well, nature has said that there's men and women. Nature says that men and women must get together to make babies. Well, sometimes nature isn't so neat and tidy, and we would do well to ponder on that a little bit, I think, about our certainties about anything about human beings. But in general, we all have this body, and society expects of these bodies to perform and act in particular ways, to do certain things, to act out certain roles, to present themselves in the world in a particular way. And that's what we would call gender. Gender roles, gender expectations, gender norms, gender stereotypes. And we call those social. In other words, societies have decided this is how boys should behave and this is how girls should behave. My favorite saying, you may have heard it yourself, is nobody is born, nobody comes out the womb knowing how to be a man or a woman. You are socialized and enculturated into sets of ideas and beliefs and practices. And that's gender, and I think what is interesting about our work is that it's that stuff that affects people's lives. Because when you go into the workplace or into a sporting arena or into politics or into a religious space, those spaces have many ideas about what those gendered bodies should do, how they should behave and how they should conduct themselves and how much they should put themselves forward or hold themselves back, too loud or not loud enough. All of that is gender. And we all swim in that gender soup all the time. For a small percentage of people, the inner gender identity doesn't match the one that is expected of them, and that goes into the category of transgender people. So yes, for me, gender is this idea that we have decided as many societies, and these ideas are similar and different across societies and even within societies. That ideas around gender can differ, for example, in the Hispanic community, the African American community, or the Asian community in the United States, for example. There will be lots of commonalities, but there will be differences as well. And for me, what is fascinating is to get people to start thinking about their gendering in the world and how much of that is natural and how much of it we've learned.
Wow, thank you. I'm sure that our listeners would be able to differentiate between the two. And you made it clear what's the difference between sex and what's the difference between gender. I think a child would be able to articulate what it is. So thank you for doing that. For a follow-up question, what theoretical lenses or framework do you bring to the gender workspace?
So I think some of them I've touched on or hinted at already. I think the ideas around feminism, I think, inform some of my own thinking. And as you would know, I'm sure, be aware, there have been waves of feminism over the years, starting in its early formations around women getting the vote, I think around reproductive independence, although there's pushback on that even today, particularly in the United States. And then moves towards more intersectional feminism. And today, I think the feminist space is quite a diverse set of ideas, including, interestingly, more recent feminist contestations around transgenderness, transness, and whether trans women are women. There's a lot of debates about that, and whether the trans rights movement has eroded some of the women's rights movement. So some of those debates are interesting for me. They keep me fascinated, intrigued. I think theory moves with the times and should be critical. It should be willing to let go of some things and take on new ideas. I think theory and work around privilege is important to me, critical race theory I know that is also has got a bad press in the United States. It's for me a very fascinating and thought-provoking set of ideas. I would say work around gender work, people like Judith Butler's thinking, introducing the idea of gender as formative, is something that has been interesting for me to work with. A lot of the work around masculinities, there's an Australian sociologist called Raywin Connell, who has done a lot of the early thinking around idea of multiple masculinities coexisting with each other in any society. And I suppose multiple femininities would be also a set of ideas to think about. And then I think coming more into the workplace context, I know in the course that you did that we worked on together, the gender at work set of ideas or model is for me a very fascinating framework to work with, because it acknowledges that workplaces are sites of power and exclusion, or inclusion sometimes, and that if you want to bring change into a workplace, you can't just work with individual beliefs and practices and ideas, that you have to work with systems of power that operate in an organization, for example, and also that you have to work with what is called the deep structure inside an organization, which you might argue is the sort of collective unconscious of a workplace. They're sort of hidden behind the scenes workings of a particular space. It's sort of unspoken ethos that also affects how that workplace sees men and women and power in that particular space. So the gendered work framework has been very powerful for me personally to think about what change could look like inside an organization.
Thank you. I would want to ask you to explain the framework, but I'm gonna, could you just explain what is the gender framework?
I could do my best to, and hopefully not do it an injustice. Essentially, the framework thinks about change as operating on two sort of continua, on the individual level and on the systemic level. And if you look at those two continuums and you place them in a two-dimensional sketch on a page, you create the idea of four quadrants of change, of possibilities of change. And quadrant one refers to the idea of individual change work. So that is work around unconscious bias, the beliefs you have about gender, the unconscious beliefs you have about men and women and how they should be inside a workplace. And then quadrant two refers to kinds of resources that are given to people to achieve power or advancement, equality in a workplace. And one example of that might be an organization might believe that it is pro-women, but it doesn't acknowledge that women might need particular kinds of career path or resources to go on management courses or leadership courses or just to generally resource the kind of work that might shift inequalities that pre-exist in many workplaces. I think in our work we distinguish between equality and equity. Mm-hmm. Equality says we treat people equally. Equity says we see that they come with different starting points because of forms of systematic exclusion. And so you might make want to find ways to hasten and accelerate the advancement of one category of person because of that historical inequality. So quadrant 2 is about resources. And quadrant 3 looks at policy work. Has there been sufficient changes in policies to give effect to the intentions to bring gender equality in the workplace? Those could be promotion policies, advancement policies, hiring policies, work-life balance policies, maternity leave, parental leave. But I think, and a particular interest of mine is sexual harassment policies as well. Are those policies properly developed, funded, enacted, monitored, evaluated? And then quadrant 4 is one of the more complicated quadrants to think about and work with, which is the deep structure quadrant. And as I suggested earlier, that is the sort of collective unconscious of an organization. And it's the kinds of things that might not be obvious to you upon first entering into or being a part of a workplace, but that sort of come to you as you think about and observe and experience the space. How do people talk to each other? How do men and women talk to each other? How are meetings run? How are decisions made? Who holds the power? Whose advancement is accelerated above somebody else's? Who gets the best offices? Who gets the best tasks inside a workplace? Whose ideas are second gaslit? So it's that sort of more ephemeral stuff that is sort of qualitative in nature. You may not easily be able to label it, but you start to feel it. And I think one of the things that the privileged work has taught me over the years is that when you belong to a marginalized or less privileged group, you feel how power works. It's almost a visceral thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that a white person, let's say in relation to race, might say, but I don't see that this workplace feels exclusionary towards Black people. But when you are a Black person, subtle ways, the microaggressions, the hidden ways, you feel it. You feel it in your bones, in your viscera. And that's somewhere where I think the deep structure is as well.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And I think that was one of the most impactful aspect of the Changemaker program, understanding the gender framework and being exposed to understanding the theory and the impact of deep structure, because I've been there and never had the terminology or the understanding of how to articulate it until the class. So thank you. In closing, would you like to add anything else?
I think perhaps the one perspective I could bring in, and I'd also like to ask you a question in return, is, without casting any shade on you, Shaman, we're both slightly older persons. And, I think one of the important things to bring into this gender conversation is to think about gender over a person's life course, that it isn't static, and how one experiences one's sex and one's gender expectations through life can shift. It's a journey. And one of the interesting things about aging is you can experience the twin forces of respect and marginalization, that you can be seen as somehow less valuable, less important, less like on the cutting edge of things because you're older. It's the way societies work. But in many communities, older people are also regarded with a certain kind of deference. or reverence, and they're carriers of wisdom. And there's truth to both of those things. But I think what has been an incredible privilege, I'm using that word again, for me, is to be able to reflect on one's gender journey over life and to realize that it has shifted. And it isn't static. And I would encourage listeners to this podcast to think about gender through the lens of time. That we thought about gender generationally, last generation, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, has shifted. And the shifts aren't always in a positive direction, as we're seeing globally some of the pushback towards some of the early wins around gender equality. So we need to be vigilant. We cannot be guaranteed that change is inevitably in positive, for me, positive direction, that those changes can be taken away. American society is an example of losing rights around abortion, for example. And now it's left to the states to make those laws, and some devastating consequences for some women. So that's one thought I have. And I suppose my other question, maybe not to unfairly shine a light on you, but this experience of setting up this gender podcast. I love the title. What did you? Everything gender?
Anything.
Anything gender. I love that because it creates such an openness. This first conversation, where has it left you? Do you feel like you want to take some things in podcast series in a particular direction, or is it too soon to say?
It's not too soon to say, because as I'm listening to you, gender in the workplace is not something that is talked about. I can say for here in America, and especially being someone who spent 20 years in the nonprofit space where that is dominated by women, we don't talk about our gender roles. We don't talk about the gender stereotypes. We don't talk about our biases, conscious or unconscious. We don't pay attention to the deep structure. Thus, that's why the framework, I held on to the framework so dearly, because it spoke to me. And I would like to create a space where we unpack those things. Understanding the role of I am from a single parent home. So I saw my mother as the father and the mother. So there was nothing, I never knew my place as a woman until I migrated to the US, right? Where I understood, okay, women, you have roles, this idea or this thought of you can do anything. You can, because at age 33, when I came to the US, I went into the US Army just a year before the cutoff age. So I can tell you the impact of ageism. I didn't have a term to use it at that time. I can tell you the impact of gender bias that I have experienced. And I didn't stay. I spent 1 year and came out. So I never knew that women, you need to know your place. That's what we would say in Guyana, that women need to know their places. And so helping to unpack those things and helping women to give them a space where they can learn more about themselves has become a passion for me after that change maker program. So I hope I answered your question.
Yes. I mean, it's given me a million other questions I want to answer. And I think one of the other thoughts that I have is, in the nonprofit space, I may be wrong, but in many contexts, they are dominated by women, which I don't think is a coincidence because we're socialized into men having positions of high-flying positions and positions of power and authority, particularly in profit-making corporate context. And sometimes the nonprofit world can be an extension of how we think about women as being in domestic sphere, doing charity work and good works. What can happen in some nonprofits is that even the ones that are really progressive and transformed and maybe women run, they can create a model of how women can lead and run and be successful. But at the end of the day, the world, gender is relational. So those into a world which is constructed for the benefit of men often. So the struggle continues. And so it's holding that idea that even if one is transformed in one space, there's work to be done outside of that space too.
Yes, and you said something, and a thought came to me. Despite the nonprofit, will be most of them, or some of them might be women led. The theories, the belief systems, the policies are rooted, or their foundations are in patriarchy.
Yeah.
Right? So you have all these women, but they're leading from the lens and the theory of men. And there's so much for us to unpack there.
Yes.
As we speak, right? I am thinking about yes, they're women, but it becomes an hierarchy. And it's still patriarchal in some ways.
And in the course, I think we often talked about the idea of women doing the work of patriarchy as well. And not because they want their own disempowerment, but because they have been marinated in a patriarchal system. It is a template we are given of how societies and organizations should run in particularly hierarchical ways. So yeah, I think those are powerful questions to ask and reflect on.
Yes, yes. And one other thing before we wrap up, that I'm interested in is inviting men into the conversation about gender-based violence, forming allyship with men so that we all can be a part of the awareness and the prevention campaign against GBV.
Absolutely. I mean, that we could have another whole podcast about this topic, but you will find other fabulous speakers, so that's good.
So thank you so much, Pierre. And let's say our listeners want to get in contact with you. How can they do so?
Probably the best is to email me. I'm not sure whether you would have a way to give them my email address that is easier than me spelling it because my name is so complicated. But I'm happy if you do.
I will add it to the show notes.
Perfect.
So thank you, Pierre. Thank you, listeners. This has been the very first episode of ENYTING Podcast, and you can listen to the podcast anywhere on any podcast platform, wherever you listen, Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon. Remember to share, remember to subscribe, and remember to download. And don't forget to give a review. I am Charmin Prince. I'm your host, and thank you for joining us. And see you next time.